Again, grade 5, this is Mr. Jeremy. I will review some science vocabulary slides from grade 5 and from other grades. So these are science topics that will probably be tested on the science checkpoint, so you need to study them. One way to study them is to listen to the videos on YouTube, listen to me pronounce the science words and definitions and key questions, and also the sentences to explain the different science concepts that you have learned. And then you can also read them out loud to yourself when you study. So let us continue. This is just the letter telling your parents about these science slides. So this is just some ideas to study the science vocabulary. You can study the definitions from the slides. It says, and your book. I would recommend both. Study these slides and then your book. You can write the definition in your own words, so try to explain it using your language. You can write a sentence that shows that you know what it means. You can write an example or fun fact from the internet, so I might do that for words that I have trouble or difficulty remembering. And you can post a different picture of the word. So the following are key science words that we use in every science unit for every science topic. So you hear in our science conversations, we say the word measure a lot. So measure is to count a specific unit. So for example, length. When we measure length, we count centimeters. When we measure mass, we count in grams. Force and weight, we count in newtons. So to measure something is to count something using units. We also say the word observe in our conversation. This is an action. Observe is to watch and listen carefully when something is happening. So in science class, we often observe during our investigations what is happening. So we watch carefully, we listen carefully, so that we can share results. Investigate is an action. It means to test an idea about something. So if you have an idea about anything, about force, motion, magnets, the sun, whatever it is, we investigate to see if an idea is true or not. Predict, we often predict before we begin to investigate. Predict is to say what you think will happen before you test an idea about something. Factor, this is an important word that I've mentioned in other videos. This is anything that can change the result of an investigation or the outcome of a race. And we call the one different factor in an investigation variable. Sometimes there are things in the investigation, or for example this race, that are not factors, like the color of the uniforms. Okay, the color of the uniform does not affect who wins the race. It's just their style. So we had the conversation about how do we make a race fair, or how do we make a science investigation fair. And we always discuss the factors that need to be the same and the one that needs to be different. So whether we're talking about a race, how to make a race fair, or how to make an investigation fair, everything needs to be the same except one different factor, which we call variable. So first we'll review the stages of plant growth. This is a science topic from grade 4. So you might look in your grade 4 book and notebook, if you still have it, for further information. So this is a plant life cycle of a bean. This is a diagram. So again, lots of diagrams we draw in science, whether they are force diagrams or food chain diagrams or um, mixtures. Here we have a plant life cycle diagram showing the first stage is what we call germination. So you can say that out loud, germination. And then the second is roots. Then is leaves. Next is flowering. And the last is seed dispersal. So after seed dispersal, the life cycle of a plant starts again and again and again. It's a cycle, so it keeps going. So what is germination? So a seed starts to grow. Germination is when a seed starts to grow when it has enough warmth. Okay, so for kidney beans, this is about 30 degrees Celsius. That's the temperature it needs to grow or to germinate. A seed does not need light because remember, it naturally grows under the ground where it is dark. So seeds can grow in darker areas, but they don't need light to grow, just enough warmth or temperature. So this is an example of how you can study the word germination. So if you would like to do this for other words, it's up to you. So roots is the second stage. So roots are the plant part. They grow usually underground. So after the seed germinates, the roots grow. Then we have the leaves. So it says, as the stem and leaves form, the plant makes its own food. We call this photosynthesis because a plant is a producer. So we learned when we, during our food chains unit, that plants are producers. They do not hunt or gather food like consumers. So once plants begin to grow leaves, they need light to make food and keep growing. So as a seed, they don't need light, but now that when a plant has leaves, they need light to make food. Flowering. Why do plants grow flowers? So flowers are pretty. We like to give them to our mom or our teacher, but why do plants actually grow them? Because they need flowers in order to make pollen, to make seeds. So that's what flowers, so we will talk more about flowers. So flowers are important in this um, experience for plants called pollination. So it's just like actors in a play, each part of the flower has a role to play. These parts are important, vital, and pollination wouldn't be able to take place without any one of these. So let's talk about these parts. If you need to watch a video about pollination to see it in action, there are 2 YouTube videos here so you can see pollination in action. So first let's talk about a petal. A petal is a part of a flower. The petal's job is to attract the insects towards the flower. Okay, so the colors, the insects, they see the colors of the flower and that attracts them. So why would flowers want to attract insects? Stamen. This is the male part of the flower. The stamen is made up of the anther and filament. So if you want to remember that these are male parts, so when we say male, male is like boy or man. Okay, so I am a male. Mr. Jeremy is a male. I colored the words in blue, and also stamen has the part of the word is M-E-N, men. So that's one way you can remember that stamen is a male part. Anther also sounds like brother. Anther, T-H-E-R, brother, T-H-E-R. And then we have filament. which filament also has the word men inside it. So that's one way to remember that filament and anther are part of the male part called the stamen. So here's the anther. The role of the anther is to produce the pollen. So there's something called pollen made by the anther. It is important that this pollen is then carried to another plant. Which part of the plant would the pollen need to be taken to? So maybe the insect can help take this thing called pollen to another plant, because plants and flowers cannot move. Filament. The filament's role is to hold up the anther. If the anther was very low down, then insects might not be able to collect that flower's pollen. What would happen if pollen was harder for insects to collect? So that's the filament is under the anther. Okay, filament is under the anther, and both of these make up the stamen. Stigma. What is a stigma? The stigma's job is to collect the pollen from other plants when insects brush by it. It has adapted to catch the pollen in different ways. For example, some stigma have tiny hairs on them to collect the pollen. It is on the stigma that germination begins to take place. So here we have the stigma part in the middle, and around the stigma we have stamen. So this plant has both stamen and stigma. Style. The style is above the ovary, and its job is to hold up the stigma. The style, ovary, and stigma all make up the female part of the plant, which is called the carpel or pistil. So how can you remember these are female parts? Well, they're in pink color, and also when I think about stigma, I see the word ma, M-A, which some people call their mother, ma, stigma. Style, women like to dress up and show their style. Okay, and then we'll talk more about ovary later. Ovary, what is ovary? The ovary's job is to hold the ovules and to keep them safe until the flower gets pollinated. So ovary is another female part, and they keep these ovules. They kind of look like eggs a little bit, as you can see in the picture on the right. So those ovules need to get pollinated. They need an insect to bring the pollen to the flower, and then they need to make contact with that pollen. So here's a flowering diagram showing you the male parts and the female parts and how you can remember them. So again, the blue parts are male parts, and the pink are female parts. So we have the stamen on one side, blue, and the pistil on the other side is pink. Stigma, style, ovary, ovule, and on the other side, anther and filament. So can you identify each of the parts without looking at the picture? And then you can check yourself by looking at the pictures. Can you describe the flower parts, each part and its function? Very important to know for the test. So what is pollination? Pollination is the process that brings pollen from the stamen to the stigma of the flower. And insects help do that when they're attracted to the petal and they get pollen on them, like this bee, then they take it to another flower. Okay, also the wind can carry the pollen. It's very light, like powder, and it can land on other flowers. So plants produce seeds in order to reproduce. To make a seed, a flower must be pollinated. Pollen is made by the male part of the plant, which is called the stamen. The pollen needs to get to the female part of the plant, which is called the stigma. Most plants cannot pollinate themselves, but a large amount of orchids can. What might be an advantage of self-pollination? So some plants have both the female and male parts and they can pollinate themselves. The pollen must then travel from one plant to another plant of the same species. For example, from a rose to a rose or from a daffodil to a daffodil. This is called cross-pollination. And there's a pollination song. Here's the link that you can hear to learn more about pollination and to study. You can actually learn the song and sing the song to study pollination. Here are the verses. If you click on play verse 1, which is the blue underline words, it will play the song for you so you can learn the melody of the song. And again, this is just a way to study the word pollination or other science vocabulary words. Fertilization. Fertilization is the process that joins the pollen and the eggs. Okay, and that leads to seeds being made. So once the ovules are fertilized, they make contact with the pollen, they can create seeds. Can you name all of the male and female parts of the flower and explain the process of pollination and fertilization? Look at the slides to help you. So next we talk about seed dispersal. This is the final stage in the plant life cycle before it starts again. Seeds are spread out so they can grow where they are not fighting for space with the parent plant. So dispersal means to spread out. How are seeds spread out? One way is by wind. For example, sycamore helicopters and dandelion clocks both have fruits which have adapted to use the wind to carry the seeds away when the seeds are ready. So you can actually Google sycamore seed falling on YouTube and see it in action. You can also Google dandelion seeds being blown by the wind and see if you can find a video on YouTube. Seeds also burst. Some plants have pods full of seeds which will burst, showering the ground with seeds, like the Himalayan balsam seed. Peas are another example of a plant bursting open to disperse its seeds. So you can see, if you search bursting or plants bursting on YouTube, or if you search Himalayan balsam seed, you might get to see what bursting looks like. Shakers. Some plants rely on being shaken to disperse their seeds. When poppies have produced their seeds and have finished flowering, all that is left is a long stem with a dried seed pod. These pods have small holes at the top and rely on wind to shake them to scatter the seeds. This method doesn't send the seeds very far. Yucca campestris seeds also need to be shaken. Water. So these are all ways that seeds are spread out, okay? And water is another way. Some plants rely on water to disperse their fruits. These will either grow on the water or by the side of the water. Water lilies live on the water, so they use the water to disperse their seeds. They make very light seeds which will float away on the water for a while, then sink to the bottom of a pond to grow a new lily. So you could search water lily growing or lily seeds on YouTube. Palm tree seeds. Palm tree seeds are very light, which helps them float and grow another palm tree elsewhere. Palm trees that grow by the oceans drop their seeds, which can be swept great distances by the ocean's currents. coconuts are well-known travelers. Willow tree seeds. Willow and silver birch trees often grow near water. Their seeds are very light, which enables them to float away on water. The silver birch seed is also fluffy, which helps them to be dispersed by the wind, too. Catching a ride. So we're still talking about seed dispersal. Some plants, such as cockleburs, have developed to grow tiny hooks on their fruits, which hook onto animals or people that pass by the plant. Eventually, they will drop off to the ground. So there's a picture of a dog who's been covered in burrs. And then we have burdock seeds. So you might search burdock seeds on YouTube. Seeds as foods. Some plants make tasty fruits. This is to encourage animals and people to eat the fruits. The seeds then pass through the animal unharmed and out the other end with a ready supply of fertilizer. Not tasty in the slightest, quite the opposite. This method ensures the seed is given nutrients to help it grow. What types of fruits can you think of that are eaten by animals and people with seeds inside? Drop and roll. Some fruits, such as horse chestnuts, have a casing around them which cracks open when it hits the ground. That's the green part. That's the casing, like a container. The fruit inside then rolls away from the tree. You can tell which horse chestnuts in the trees are ripe because their casings have already begun to split open before they drop. So you might search horse chestnut on YouTube and see what you can find. So why do plants disperse their seeds, and list the ways in which the seeds are dispersed? How many ways do you remember without looking at the slides? And then go back and look at the slides. So like I mentioned earlier, you can search seeds on YouTube or Google them for more information. You can see the maple seed flying in the air, or the sycamore seed, or the dandelion seed. The Touch Me Not seed pod, you can see that one burst on YouTube. Cleaver seeds, they have the hooks that, look at the shirt, the boy's shirt, they hook onto plants or, they hook onto animals or humans. And then you can also search squirting cucumber seed pod to see it burst. It's actually a really cool video. Just search the name on YouTube and you can see it in action. So our next unit is food chains. Remember, a food chain is a way to describe the feeding relationship between plants and animals. It shows a transfer of energy through food. So do you remember what the arrows mean in our food chain diagram? This is a way to study food chain. Remember, write your own definition, sentence, give a fun fact or example, and write or put a new picture. So remember, the arrow in the food chain diagram can mean two things: is eaten by or gives energy to. So our food chain explanation, we can say a leaf is eaten by a snail. Snails are eaten by a turtle. A turtle is eaten by a crocodile. Or you can say leaves give energy to the snail. The snail gives energy to the turtle. The turtle gives energy to the crocodile. So why do we color the word leaves yellow? Because the leaves are producers from plants. Why is snail green? Because snails are herbivores. They only eat plants. Turtle is green and red because it's an omnivore. It eats both plants and animals. And then crocodile is red because crocodile is a carnivore. Okay, it only eats meat. So here's an example of a food chain diagram that we just discussed. And notice we also have the word prey and predator. So the predator in this food chain is the crocodile because it hunts for turtle. And the turtle is also a predator because it hunts for snails, but a turtle is also prey because a crocodile hunts it. So the turtle is the prey of the crocodile. And a snail is not a predator because it doesn't hunt animals. It's an herbivore. But a snail is prey because a turtle hunts a snail. So in our food chain, we have first the producer, right? It's energy from the sun. Then we have the primary consumer, comes next. Secondary consumer after that. And the tertiary consumer comes last. So this just explains um, and justifies our food chain. So I will read it, and then you can listen and then read it out loud when you study. I think the leaf is the first organism in the food chain because it is a producer. It gets its energy directly from the sun. The primary consumer in this food chain is the snail because it is an herbivore and gets its energy from plants. It is one organism, one step from the sun's energy. The secondary consumer in this food chain is the turtle because it gets its energy by eating an herbivore. It is two steps from the sun's energy. And finally, the tertiary consumer in this food chain is the crocodile because it is a carnivore and eats animals. In this food chain, it is three steps from the sun's energy. So when you study, you can read these sentences. The predator in the food chain is or are, if there's more than one. The prey in the food chain is or are, if there's more than one. And you can use these food chain explanations to explain the following food chains. This is also in your notebook. So we have food chains here. You can explain these use the previous slide, the slide before, to explain these different food chains. These are questions to think about. Can two carnivores be in the same food chain? You can look at the food chain examples that we saw before. Can two omnivores be in the same food chain? Is that possible? Is an omnivore always in a food chain with at least two consumers? Is a carnivore always in a food chain with at least two consumers? Is an herbivore always in a food chain? Must an herbivore always be in a food chain? Can a carnivore be a primary consumer? Why? Can an omnivore be a primary consumer in a food chain? Why? Can an herbivore be a secondary consumer in a food chain? Which two types of consumers could be a primary consumer in a food chain? Why? Number 5, which two types of consumers could be a secondary consumer in a food chain? Why? Number 6, which two types of consumers could be a tertiary consumer in a food chain? Why? Next unit is body systems. So heart rate is the number of heartbeats for 1 minute. BPM stands for beats per minute, and pulse is the pressure you feel when your heart pumps blood. So what apparatus can we use to measure heart rate? We can use a timer or a stopwatch. Picture. So we also learned about the circulatory system, and we made a model. So we had a picture of the heart that represented the heart. We had red string that represented blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart, and blue string, blood vessels that carry blood to the heart. And then we had if you remember, we had a person walking around. So the person walking around represented the blood that was circulating. So arteries are the blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart, and veins carry the blood toward the heart, and the arrows show away and toward. Blood is a red liquid that flows around the body. So we have blood vessels also without oxygen and blood vessels with oxygen. So pump is what the heart does as it releases blood throughout the body. Circulate is what the blood does as it goes around the body and around and around and around. Heartbeat we already talked about. Here is a diagram of the kidneys. We learned about kidneys and the parts. So what is the function of the brain and the nervous system? So look in your notebook for more information, but you should have used all of these words, including brain, spinal cord, nerves, lungs, heart, small intestine, eyes, ears, hands, feet, mouth, controls, connects, messages, or signals. So here we have pictures of the two most important parts of the nervous system. We have the brain on the left and the spinal cord, including the nerves. So if you remember when we made our model of the nervous system, we had string to represent the nerves, and we had messages, letters from the brain to different body parts, and also from different body parts back to the brain. And this reminds you, you can look in your notebook too, of the parts of our nervous system model and what they represented. I just mentioned that. Okay, this is going into respiratory system. So that's breathing, oxygen. Inhale means to breathe in gas. Exhale is to breathe out. The name of the gas that we breathe out is carbon dioxide. And then the lungs are the most important part of the respiratory system. And these are other parts of the respiratory system, including the nose, the mouth, the trachea, also known as the windpipe, and the diaphragm. So we also made a model of the respiratory system just to get an idea of how it works. So remember, we agreed that the hole in the straw was the nose or mouth, nose and mouth. The straw was the trachea or windpipe. The balloon represented the lungs because that was taking in the air. Plastic bag was the diaphragm, and the plastic bottle represented the ribs. So what is the function of the respiratory system? This is an important question. You should be able to use the words inhale, exhale, oxygen, carbon dioxide, diaphragm, lungs, mouth, nose, and trachea. Digestive system. Here's some information for you to read. I won't read all of it. These are the parts of the digestive system. Also look in your notebook for more information about where to put them. And now I will review a unit from grade 3 called Animals and Adaptations. So when we classify animals, we can classify them into two main groups. The first is vertebrates, so that's animals that have bones that make a skeleton. So we know chickens are vertebrates because when we eat KFC, there's a bone inside, right? Invertebrates, animals that do not have bones that make a skeleton. We know that snails do not have bones because when we take them out of the shell, we don't have to take a bone out. Habitat. A habitat is a place or area where an animal feels safe and comfortable. An animal can eat, drink, breathe, and protect itself here. So it's any area where an animal lives. Adapted means that an animal, it's a change. Adapted means a change to a body part that helps an animal feel more safe and comfortable in a place. The change helps an animal eat, drink, breathe, protect itself, and live in a habitat. So animals that have these changes over time are able to survive longer in their habitat. So environments or habitats really affect how animals develop their body parts over time, over a long time. For example, we have an adaptation of webbed feet. So webbed feet are like fins. So a penguin has webbed feet. Webbed feet are for what? Swimming in water. A penguin is adapted to a water habitat because it has webbed feet. So a penguin also has feathers. Feathers are another adaptation. So fill in the blank. A penguin has thick feathers are for what? In what kind of habitat? Wet habitat, dry habitat, cold habitat, hot habitat. What do you think? So we have another animal here called an eagle and it has talons. So talons are like a hook or like scissors, and a sharp beak. So actually the sharp beak is more like scissors and the talons are more like the hook. So you see the picture of the hook on the left and the scissors. So an eagle has talons and a sharp beak. A long sharp beak is for, what do you think a sharp beak is for? What do you think talons are for? And look at the picture. Where does the eagle live? What kind of habitat? What do you think this bird eats? Look at picture number 1. Why? Do you think that bird eats like a really large fish, or like a small berry, or a small insect? Number 2, what do you think this bird eats? Look at that bird's habitat. What kind of food do you think bird in picture number 2 eats? Do you think he's eating like insects or fruit? And number 3, how does the bear stay comfortable in its habitat? I hope this helped you grade 5. If you have your grade 3 science book and notebook, you should use those for more information about animal adaptations and habitats.